So what I'll firstly do is, if you are looking for more stuff about British parliamentary, these are three, I think, fantastic videos. The first one is a training done by Tom Stansfield, who's a slightly older mad debater. And if you have watched that video, you might notice that I have stolen some graphics and a few other things from him, because he gave, I think, a really fantastic session. So I would recommend watching that. Will Jones did a series of lectures on how to do opening government a few years ago. So if you want to know more about that, I would highly recommend you check it out. It's like 50 minutes or something ridiculous, but would recommend. It also covers a lot of stuff to British parliamentary. And finally, there's a video done by Kieran who covered BP adjudicating. Also gives you a scale in terms of how to turn 3-on-3 adging into BP adging, which I often refer to. Also, I'll say credit to Deepak and Anita, who made the first half of this presentation for last year that I've basically stolen for this one, just because it was very good. And so hopefully that works here. Okay, so what's the goal of the session? It will be a quick rundown of what happens in a BP debate for people who've never really seen BP before, or just generally a revision session if you've done BP before. Go over some tips and strategies for the unique parts of British parliamentary, so dealing with positions, extensions, points of information, and the like. Please ask questions, and I'll try and make this as applicable as I can, as much as possible. And I promise also many terrible jokes and terrible photos throughout it to try and make it entertaining. Okay, so what I wish I had known BP before I really started doing it. Yes, that is indeed a photo of me. So the first thing is, if you have done something before in 3-on-3 and the like, don't try and totally change how you speak. Don't try and think this is a brand new style and there are no transferable skills. There are things you can bring over. There are more similarities between British parliamentary and 3-on-3 than not. I will be using some words like strategy more often in BP because that's a key difference. But otherwise, if you can make arguments in 3-on-3, you should really still stick to those same skills when it comes to making arguments in BP. The second thing that I think is useful is in 3-on-3, you either win or you lose the debate. In BP, there's first through to fourth. And I think it is useful to think about why, or like, I might not be able to get first in this room, but how might I be able to get second? Because I think at times there are some things out of your control. Your opening team was just too good, and they were able to make too good of a case. And if I want to try and win the debate, I have to do some ridiculous things. I have to take some huge risks that are just not worth it. It might be better to, run something else that might get me to second. I can beat up the other two teams in this room, but I might not be able to beat that team that got first. So it's always worth thinking about, what, like, a second is not too bad to get in that room. It's better than, running something really whack and getting the fourth. The third thing, and I'll always say this, don't panic. If you panic, bad things happen. You start going for things that are not the strongest arguments and you don't really flesh out what you need to flesh out. The final thing, and I'll bring this up a few times, like in 3-on-3, there are clashes. So when you might give a third speaker speech, you might talk about the themes or the clashes that came up in the debate. That is still true in British parliamentary, and that's a really important skill to carry over. Because if you can identify those clashes, you can figure out the best way for extensions to really get in and resolve them and win the debate. If you're not engaging with clashes, it probably means in some ways you're kind of ignoring the rest of the debate, and the adjudicator gets very confused about why you're not engaging with the debate and either thinks that you are, absolutely fantastic and gives you the first or gives you the fourth, which is probably not a risk that you want to take too often. Okay, so what is BP? So the people who have done BP before, what are the key differences in terms of speaking time, prep time, and number of speakers? This is the interactive part of the session.
So can I just jump in?
Go ahead.
Sure. So speaking times are 7 minutes instead of 8. There are 8 speakers all up instead of 6 and 4 teams. And I can't remember what the other question was.
No, that was
prep time.
You'll only get half the prep time.
Yeah, that one as well. You only get 15 minutes to prep. With the 7-minute speeches, how do they play out? What's the structure of it?
The first minute and last minute are protected time, and then in the middle, people can ask you POIs.
Boom. Excellent. Yeah. So there are those couple of differences. In terms of structure, so instead of having two teams, the affirmative and the negative, you now have two teams on the government bench who are affirming the motion, two teams who are on the opposition bench who are negating the motion. And each of those are then split within an opening and a closing team. And as you might be able to see, the opening teams go first and the closing teams go second. And they have to bring what's called an extension to the debate, which we'll cover in a lot of depth later. But I hope that's clear. So it follows the same structure as 3-on-3. Just imagine there are now two more speakers on the end, and yeah, there's a rift, and you're trying to beat the other team on your bench, but also beat the other people across the aisle. Okay, so what is the name of the first speaker of the opening government and opening opposition, and what is their role?
The Prime Minister and the opposition minister.
Yep. Well,
leader.
What's their role?
Do they just introduce the debate? It's like a first speaker kind of in a 3-on-3.
Yep, exactly. So they're all about setting up the debate that happens. And I'll go through each speaker position similar to how it might be in 3-on-3. But in many ways, you should not be looking at a prime minister or leader of the opposition any differently to a first affirmative, first negative speech. They still need to do the same things. They need to give a model. They need to give basic arguments for and against. Opposition leader needs to engage with the prime minister. All of those things don't change just because you're now in a BP debate. Okay, what are the second speakers, or the second speakers on both opening government and opening opposition, and what is their role? Think of it this way. We have Scott Morrison as our Prime Minister. So you must have who in second?
Deputies.
Sorry?
Deputy, the DPM.
Correct. And then Deputy Leader of the Opposition. What is their role?
They respond to the case from the other side, and they extend the substantive material of their team.
Ding, ding, ding.
What he said.
Yeah. So they need to build up what might have come out earlier in terms of fixing flaws, in terms of extending new material, a new argument, and also responding to each other. So again, very similar to a second affirmative and second negative, in that they can't just get up and give the first affirmative, first negative speech again, because that adds nothing. They need to find things to add on to help out their team. Okay, let's move on to closing half. What are the first speaker of closing government and first speaker of closing opposition called?
Government member and opposition member.
Boom. And what is their role?
Essentially provide an extension, which is like different reasons for the same case.
Yeah. So they need to introduce an extension for their team because they're a new team in this debate. They're the closing version of the team that has come before. They also need to respond to arguments that have appeared in the debate. I would again say that they have a lot of similarities with second affirmative, second negative. In that you need to bring something new to the debate. You can't argue exactly what has come out at first affirmative. In this case, because you would be just copying what had come out by your opening government, which might mean that your government bench is doing very well, but you're not doing very well because you're not adding anything to the debate. So as a team, you get called what's known as derivative, where you haven't added anything. And if anything, you're just making your opening team look absolutely fantastic. So you need to bring something new. You need to extend on what they've already talked about. Okay, then finally, what are the names of the final two speakers of the debate from closing government and closing opposition, and what is their role?
Government, it's the whips, the government whip and the other whip, opposition whip.
Yep.
Essentially, they have to restate like the case and show why they won. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of similarities to a third speaker speech. I would say there's a bit more that needs to be done in terms of showing how your team won the debate or did very well in the debate. Just because instead of normally being, talking about how fantastic you guys are and how fantastic the other, how bad the other team is, you now need to engage with 3 other teams, one of which is on your bench. So you need to be more careful with your language. But it is a lot of the same skills that you would do at a third speaker need to be deployed here. You need to have an overview of the debate. You need to talk about the material your team has brought and why that's so important. Patch in any holes and rebut the other closing team that has popped up in the debate. So it is, again, worthwhile looking at it as if it's a third affirmative, third negative speech. And that also means there are limits on what you can bring up as new arguments because there are so few speakers after you. If you're closing opposition, you're the final speaker of the debate. You can't bring in a brand new argument. So those rules still apply like they would in round 3. Okay, so another new thing is an extension. This is a new contribution to the team, a new contribution to the debate from the closing half. It wants to set itself up as the most important material in the debate. And there's a whole spectrum of, I suppose, things that can constitute an extension. It is basically anything that is new. It can be a brand new argument. It can be a brand new argument about a context. It can be all the way down to something as small as little bits of rebuttal or little bits of framing and setup in terms of, here's stuff that's being said in the debate, but it's all been very messy. I'm just going to give it a bit of a touch up so it all makes sense in the overall debate. And here's how, a certain team has really won. That is a contribution to the debate. It is an extension. It might not be the strongest extension, but it is something new and something that's not come up in the debate earlier. And you need to highlight what those things are different, why they are new, why they are so important to the debate, and how that helps you win the debate overall. And so you can run multiple pieces of extension. They can be substantive. They can be rebuttal. It is worthwhile thinking about how you can dress up a point of rebuttal as a point of substantive. That's just a matter of, changing how you're looking at it and then making sure you're directly addressing the other team. But at the end of the day, it is a piece of rebuttal that you might be suggesting as a substantive argument that clashes with something that has come out earlier. But basically, it's something new and you need to highlight what's new about it. Okay, the other new thing are points of information. You are allowed to ask a member of the opposition bench. So if you're closing government, you can't ask a POI to your opening government. Not allowed. But you can ask to opening opposition or closing opposition when they're speaking. Ideally, you should be aiming to take 3 to 4 POIs across your team. And this is where the words strategic and unstrategic start popping up. If you're taking more than two POIs in a speech, that's generally when you're starting to give up too much time to the other teams to kind of raise their arguments for them to talk. So it is important that you take a couple so you can really engage with other teams in the debate. You don't want to take so many that, you have no time for your own arguments because you're spending so long listening and, responding to the POIs that come up. You have to be able to give a POI within 15 seconds or else you are out of order. You can only ask POIs outside of the first and last minutes of the other person's speech. You don't want to ask POIs all the time. That is called badgering, when basically you get up, give a POI, get rejected, immediately pop up again, give a POI. Try and give like a 15 to 20 second break between each POI so you're just not annoying the other person, but you are reminding them that you're there and you really, really just want to ask them a question. And what's really important about POIs is they're a way to engage with the rest of the debate. If you're opening or closing half and the debate's happening in the other half, it's a way that you can engage and play out with the debate instead of, if you're closing half, waiting 45 minutes before you're able to speak, or if you're opening half, waiting another half an hour before you can finally, finish up with the debate and go off and do whatever you want. So it's really important to know that there are those POIs, but also just make sure they don't become your speech. You want to make sure they're only a part of it. And we'll get into some of the strategy of that later. Okay, so I know that's a relatively quick run over of British parliamentary. Does anyone have any questions about British parliamentary or how it works or anything like that?
But Drew, with 4 teams, how does topic selection work?
Good question. There is no topic selection. You get one topic. And if you don't like it, bad luck, you have to debate it. Yeah, unfortunately. Any other questions? Anything?
Just with like having 2 teams on each side, at any time other than like really passive aggressively, should like the team on the same side the team on the same side should like closing government ever address opening government's speech? Like, do you ever explicitly say why your arguments are better, or do you just like frame it in terms of they're better than the opposition side?
Yeah, so you should never get up and basically be like, right, those opening government people absolutely cooked the debate. They were awful. We really don't know why they rocked up. You can't directly attack them like that. What it's more about is you might be, there was this kind of contribution from opening government, which, it was really nice and it was really solid, but what we bring, is far more important. Or here were the things that were missing from opening government, and here's why it's so important that we add things. So it's all about highlighting, firstly, the differences between you two. So in terms of what brand new things you're bringing and what's different, but also why they're particularly important in the debate. So it might be, because otherwise the adjudicator might think, oh, that's a relatively small flaw, that material's not so important. You really need to highlight, how important that difference is. And when you start doing that, that's when it really shows that your contribution is bigger and better than what had come out from opening. But basically, it's all about, being very nice and being very, very friendly when you're going through in terms of how you've beaten them. You can't explicitly, basically attack them. And also the other ways of doing it is it might be opening government, did all right against opening opposition. We're going to fully beat opening opposition in this debate and really show how we win.
I just want to jump in here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think what Andrew was talking about earlier is basically the nice way to be closing government. And everything he says is absolutely true. Try not to knife your opening as much as you can. But I just want to point out that there's been a trend in the recent years of being very explicit when it comes to dealing with your opening. And you may consider it knifing, you may consider it just like sort of straddling the line between the two, but that is a strategy that people sometimes employ. So don't think that knifing your opening is something that you definitely shouldn't do. Sometimes if your opening is saying very dumb stuff, there is no two ways about it. You have to say, nope, opening is definitely wrong on this thing. This is why, or whatever you're saying is correct.
Yeah, and we'll get into the art of knifing a little bit later. In terms of the question that I've got in the chat, in terms of if you're uncomfortable with the topic, best thing to do would be to talk to, at tournaments, there are equity teams or the CA team about it. But usually the thing about BP, because there is only one topic and there is no real option about it, they usually, make sure that the topic is going to not be uncomfortable, or, that the topic that everyone has to debate is going to be enjoyed by everyone, and it's not, going to make people feel uncomfortable or anything like that. But talk to, in this context, talk to me, talk to Peter, and we can figure something out. Okay. By the way, if it's not clear enough in this PowerPoint, one of them is a normal house and the other one's an extension where they built something on top of the house. Get it? Get it? Anyway, moving on. Okay, so if you are in opening half, as I've said earlier, don't panic. I know you're going to be like, there are 15 minutes. My God, I need things to say. Quick, quick, quick. Don't panic. One thing that pops up in that Will Jones lecture in particular is you can ask yourself two, I think, important questions that can get the ball rolling in prep time, especially if you have absolutely no idea about the topic. The first one is, where has this been done before? Because if you're able to start figuring out places that this might have been done before, and most of the time, a topic has been done before somewhere. If it's a particularly social motion, might have been done in Scandinavia for all you know. So you can think about, where has it been done before? Has it been done well? Has it been done poorly? If you don't really know that, or you're still looking for more things, it's always worthwhile asking who wants this. And that's getting at, what are the classic stakeholders or groups affected by this topic? But at the very least, you're able to identify some actors who might want this topic to happen or might not want this topic to happen. And when you've identified those, you can go through the reasons as to why they might want it to happen, why they might not want it to happen. And that's when you can start constructing that case, because you're starting to build up those arguments and you've got those beginning links. The next thing I'll say is be clear in your characterization of the debate. You want to make sure that what you say is, what the world looks like, or how certain actors operate, or what the interests are on actors are very clear, because that is a way that you can stay relevant throughout the debate, but also just ensure that, a closing team isn't able to get up and go, well, opening half was very messy, and we're just going to clear things up, because the adjudicator will go, thank God. Thank you so much for saving me from, the 30 minutes of unclarity that just occurred. So always be very clear in your characterization, because then you force closing teams to engage with that characterization, which means you're always staying relevant in the debate. And the final thing is, I think it is far better at opening half to go for in-depth arguments than trying to go very broad and cover everything you can. Because when you try and do that, that's when you leave a lot of room for closing teams to just add more depth to whatever they want, as opposed to feeling that they need to bring something in a lot of depth and really challenge that against something that you've brought that is also very concrete and is able to stand by the end of the debate. So you want to make sure that you have a clear contribution by the end. And so when the adjudicators sit down to look over their notes, they're very clear what you guys argued, and they're able to weigh that directly against closing, instead of closing going, well, they filled in a bunch of gaps, therefore they get up over their opening. All right. In terms of tips for closing half, I would say don't commit to an extension too early. Don't feel like I've got a bunch of ideas, 10 minutes into prep time, I now need to start turning this into an extension. Sometimes you'll kind of get the vibe that it's probably an extension because it's, slightly, left of center, it's slightly out of nowhere. There is no way that an opening team is going to come up with this, but sometimes they do. So it's always worth making sure you've listened to at least part of the debate before you commit to an extension, just so you're sure the extension is totally relevant. The last thing you need is, some debate that's been going on about opening half has talked about governments, they've talked about, consumers, and you get up and you go, now guys, let's talk about the oceans. And the adjudicator wonders what the hell just happened to their beautiful debate. So it's always a matter of listening to the debate that has happened to you, but also, and I think my crazy example still applies, be thinking of the ways that you are going to be able to beat other teams in the debate. So that's looking at what are the shortfalls in their analysis. What, have they pushed for, and how would we be able to beat that team? And when you figure those things out, that's the way that you can craft an extension to deal with those specific things, or the ideas that you've come up in prep that you're able to apply there. The other thing is, I think it's always good to be clear on what your extension is. The last thing you need from an adjudicator is after the debate to go, I wasn't really certain what your extension was. I don't know what it really added to the debate. And I think there's a couple of things you can do. There was an old mad debater called Keith who always talked about giving extensions cool names. For example, following a very basic structure of X of Y. For example, Purity of Doctrine, which was run by one Monash team in the grand final, and they repeated it, I think, about 10 separate times throughout their speeches. And so when the adjudicators look at their notes, they're just going to go, my God, I think closing opposition ran something about purity of doctrine. It also, I think, is a level of art to extensions that is missing. But that's something to think about. The more important thing is, use the words, and I know it's lame, but use the words, our extension is this, or our extension is doing this in the debate and adding here. Because that really highlights to an adjudicator, cool, this is exactly what's happening. It's really important in the debate and I can't miss this. So those are my recommendations for closing half. Okay, so the next couple of slides, I think, deal with a lot of questions and a lot of things I got from people in terms of some derivation of, I don't know what to do for an extension, I'm really confused, or we run something and it never really goes anywhere, or it's just whack and crazy and we lose. There are, I think, two broad kinds of extensions that can be run. And you can think of it this way in terms of what kind of extension am I doing, because that allows you to fill in the cracks and how to kind of sell it. The first one is you're running a brand new argument to shift the debate. Maybe oceans in a debate about government and consumers is really, really relevant to whatever that topic is. And you can run it. And that's really going to shift everything that has been said earlier to something different. It's a brand new argument. It's about new stakeholders, new context. The other one is an argument that aims to identify a clash that has come up previously. Let's say it's about governments or consumers, and you're going to find the way to win that clash, right? You've identified the weaknesses or the things that were missing that meant opening government couldn't win the clash, and you've therefore figured out the holes in opening opposition that are going to help you win the clash. And it's not a brand new argument, but it's a series of ideas and a series of things you can bring that are going to win that opening clash. And maybe you don't win it. Maybe the adjudicator goes, opening government still did a lot. But at the very least, you might be able to get yourself a second, because you've shown you've beaten opening opposition. You've also shown that you've engaged with the best material in the debate, which might be opening governments. And hopefully you've been more relevant than closing opposition. We'll get to some of that strategical stuff later. But those are the kinds of extensions. The second part of this, I think, are just a series of ideas for extensions. Hopefully they're applicable whenever, whatever the topic is. They're things to think about when you're trying to come up with an extension. One, you can create a brand new argument. You can think of new stakeholders. You can think of new contexts, new areas the debate has never talked about. Maybe a more reasonable stakeholder in my example would be something like businesses. They've talked about governments, they've talked about consumers. We're going to talk about businesses. Or it might be the classic thing of, this debate has been in the developed world. We're going to talk about the developing. And the important thing about all of that is noting where you're radically shifting this debate and making sure that you're highlighting why that shift in the debate is justified. Why is it particularly important in the overall debate? You don't want the adjudicator to go, that's all really interesting stuff, but I don't think it was really relevant to the debate that happened in front of me. I think you're going to get the fourth in this debate. So you want to make sure you're highlighting, why is this so important? Why is it relevant? Why is it a legitimate part of the debate? Next thing you can do, you can kind of flip an argument that has come out from opening. This is particularly if opening has only done, I suppose, half the job. Maybe they talk about why a policy is particularly fantastic, but they seem to forget the harms that might occur if the motion doesn't happen. And I'll steal yet again from Tom Stansfield's lecture. But one example he had was in terms of parole. And their opening opposition, I think, ran something about, if you still give people parole, here are the, XYZ benefits that come out of that. But something you can do at closing opposition is talk about, well, if you don't have things like parole or don't let people out of jail early, here's the behaviors they engage with because they have no incentive to do anything else. They might join gangs. They might, within prison, they might, no longer do things like good behavior. They might not engage with the system as much. So if a team has only talked about the benefits that might come out of a motion, there is a lot of room to highlight the harms of not doing something, and vice versa. If they want to talk about the harms of not pulling out a motion that might be in the status quo, there's a lot of room in the benefits that you can do. So just flipping that opening argument and really showing why it's important. There's also deeper analysis of openings arguments. So they might touch on a stakeholder and why they're better, why they're benefited, and things like that. But you can extend upon that. You can kind of talk about other benefits that might come to that stakeholder, why they're likely to occur if your opening hasn't done that. So, but you again need to make sure that you're highlighting what is new. You don't want to just leave the adjudicator thinking that you've also talked about the same stakeholder and also proven the same things. You want to highlight what's new and what's different and why that's so important to the debate and show why you're winning off that. The other stuff is in terms of rebuttal. There might be a lot of rebuttal just because, your opening government basically just wanted to talk about one thing. Maybe they wanted to talk about oceans and they never engaged with opening opposition. And you as closing government go, right, our single job or one part of our extension will be engaging with opening opposition. And here's the rebuttal we are going to give that beats opening opposition. And that's so important because, you know, it proves X of our case. The other stuff that I think you can also look at is you can look at things from a time lens. So you might go, what are the long-term or short-term benefits? Often debates are about the short term in terms of, you know, what's immediately going to happen or what's going to happen in 5 years. There's always room in terms of long term. What happens at generations as they move on? What is going to be the flow on of this debate? Another one is you might be able to get a lot of room in terms of setting a bar lower. If opening government wants to claim a lot of things, you might just go, look, even if we can't get all of that, at least we can get this small thing, which has a huge benefit in the overall scheme of things. And so you can engage with that even if argument and turn it into more of an extension and why that's so important for X, Y, Z reasons. And that's kind of just highlighting that you're dealing with a different version of events. And you might be in a way avoiding something opening government couldn't prove, and you're going to prove something else instead. And it's just, maybe it's a small thing that is really important to some people, and that's, you know, going to win you the debate. You can also think about, does this send a particular message? Is there a signal to certain groups? Is there a precedent that is particularly good? Is this small thing a turning point for some other larger social reform or economic change that is currently occurring? So by itself, maybe its benefits or its effects are small, but here's how it plays into some other change or some other factor that could lead to a bigger change. The final one is if the motion is something like, as X actor, we would do Y. If the opening half is engaged with a bunch of interests of an actor, there is always room to go, here is another interest that this actor should have. And here's why it's the most important interest in this debate. I mean, it's a factor to consider in terms of what that interest is. If it's a small interest like, we really want them to, you know, have that chocolate bar, and we're talking about North Korea disarming their nukes, probably not the most important interest in the debate. But it might be America has domestic interests that it really needs to care about, and it cares about these things far more than its international allies. And maybe that's not a thing that's been touched on by opening half. And you can say that that's the interest we want to defend, and it's the most important interest for XYZ reasons. So I hope this helps in terms of ideas for extensions, places you can look and things to think through and try and see if they apply to the motion in front of you. Does this make sense to everyone as ideas? Okay, cool. All right, tips for POIs. So I think at the very least, I can't necessarily teach you the best way to think of a POI. I can at the very least give you a bunch of tips in how to do them better. Firstly, if a person says something that is a little bit stupid, resist the urge to hop up immediately and point out how stupid they are. Maybe they say something very silly. Don't engage with them on that moment, because that doesn't help in the overall scheme of things. Maybe it just shows, you know, it really highlights to the adjudicator how silly an argument was or how silly that speaker is. But it's not helping you in the overall scheme of the debate. It's not pushing you forward, it's not pushing you back. So don't engage in spontaneous rebuttal. Really think through what this POI is meant to do. The second thing, write them down and share them with your teammate. It's a thing to work on as a team, to tweak things like adjectives to make them better, to make them shorter or longer if that's needed. So it's something to work on. Don't just have it sitting in your mind and keep it in your mind, because eventually you'll forget some part of it, and then you'll look very silly when you get up to give the POI and you forget the punchline and you forget the other half of it, or it's far, far too long and you could have made it shorter, but because you didn't write it down, you didn't know that. And while you're waiting to be taken, it's always worthwhile thinking about, if I got this POI, how would I answer it? Because you don't want a POI that is basically, I'm just going to throw all my eggs in the basket of them saying yes. And if they say yes, fantastic, we're good to go. But you kind of forget that the other person might just say no, in which case you're a little bit stuffed. So it's always worth thinking about, can I craft this POI that gives us some material if they say yes or if they say no? Or am I okay with the fact of them saying no? Don't just put all of your eggs in the basket of one response. Think through how you might reply to it. It especially helps if you're sitting there for 5 minutes because they're not going to take a POI to really craft the best POI and change it a bit. Okay, if you're taking POIs, as I've talked about before, don't prioritize them over your own arguments. Take them when you're ready. Don't feel bad in telling people to sit down, say you'll take them later. Don't feel bad. Don't feel like you have to accept their POIs. As I'll get to more later, I know this is going to be counterintuitive, but you should be taking POIs as much as possible from the stronger opposition team. You want to engage with the best material in the debate. And it might be nice to pick on that poor team who might have missed the debate a little bit, haven't brought the strongest arguments, but that might mean, great, you've confirmed them getting the 4th, but you're now only probably going to get the 3rd because you've only been able to show that you've beaten that team. You want to engage with the strongest teams in the debate as much as possible because you either can beat them and show your way of getting a 1st or a 2nd, or at the very least, you've engaged with the team that came 1st or 2nd, or let's say 1st, and you're the team that did the best job engaging with them. So you're going to basically piggyback off them and get the 2nd. So you always want to make sure you're tackling the strongest team, and that applies in your rebuttal as well, but especially with POIs. The final thing is, make sure you give some kind of immediate response. Don't be the person that's like, I will get to this later, and then you never get around to it. And then the adjudicator goes, hang on. You never reply to that POI. It never looks good. Make sure you give some kind of quick response or deal with it then and there. Don't try and push it off till later. Okay. In terms of asking and crafting the POI, things to think of. Think about why you want to ask this POI. What is it meant to do in the debate? What do you want the other speaker to do? Think about how you can point out contradictions and tensions. Make sure you're not just being like, isn't this a contradiction? Kind of point out what the effects of that contradiction or tension might be, point out the failures of logic that might happen, or lay a trap in terms of getting someone to walk in to saying yes to something that seems reasonably obvious, and you go, right, cool, we now have fantastic extension material because opening opposition just allowed it into the debate by saying yes to this POI. And that's a way that you can kind of set up an extension very subtly in terms of asking a slightly weird question that gets you into the debate. What you don't want to do is simply point out some area of their logic that is missing, because that's just basically highlighting to the speaker, hey, just as a friendly reminder, you kind of didn't fill in this bit of analysis. Could you please do that for us? It doesn't really help you. You want to make sure you're dealing either a lot of damage or helping you guys out a lot in terms of bringing up your material again and forcing them to engage with that, or setting up an extension or some argument later. So think about what you want this POI to do. And if it's just, I want to respond to them, then you can do a lot better and focus on something stronger because that helps you more. Okay. Oh yeah, this is fantastic. I'm not sure if you've seen this before. This is from a world semi-final. And this is kind of the goal of a POI that you want to be able to ask, or at the very least get this kind of reaction. Basically, DLO had been going on about why is it particularly important to have effectively freedom of speech around pornography and, I think the wording is like any titillating images. So a lot of the freedom of speech around that. And opening government asked this as their POI. You want to be, that's kind of, were people able to hear that?
That was really underwhelming, True.
Nah, I couldn't hear it.
Maybe just put subtitles.
You could just annotate it.
How about you do the voices, True?
Hey, you the voice, True.
Okay, no, I won't do that. You can look up.
Maybe
you can look up later. Basically, the point is, they asked the POI that's basically like, would you allow people to have sex in public? And he can't give an answer for about 15 seconds. And the end answer he can give is basically to ask the adjudicator to figure out what would be principally correct. You can either say yes or you can say no to that question, but you need to pick one. And also, when you're asking POIs, I suppose the goal to aim for is to have a confounding reaction like that. You can look it up later in terms of the 2012 semi-final. It's fantastic. Watch it. Anyway. Okay. The final thing about POIs. And I think this used to be more true a few years ago, but it's less true now as a habit. But if you're closing government, you should really aim to leak your extension to the deputy leader of the opposition. If you're closing opposition, you want to try and get your extension into government member's speech, because you want to make sure that your extension is getting into the debate. You don't want to highlight it if you're closing opposition to Prime Minister, because then you give everyone heaps of time to figure out what your extension is and how they're going to deal with it. But you want to leak it out earlier so the adjudicator at least is thinking about it before you get up to speak, and you're forcing the speaker before you to engage with the material that you're currently giving. And that also works on the flip side. If you are a government member or deputy leader of the opposition, take it from the closing team that's about to appear, because that's a way that you can engage with their extension before it appears, especially if you're closing government, because there's only one speaker, which is your government whip, who's going to be able to deal with closing opposition. So it's really important to try and get an idea of what their extension is, give your partner a bit more time to react, but also try and give some response to it before it comes out, because otherwise you're going to have no time to respond to it at all. Okay. Any questions about that?
I hate to be really irritating with a basic question.
No, totally fine.
But if we have enough time, could you just go over quickly how POIs work? Just also specifically, like when asking a POI, do you just say I have a POI, or do you say the POI and the person chooses to take it all?
Yeah, that's totally fine. So you get up and ask. So online format is a bit different. The speaker or the person about to get up to speak might have a preference. Otherwise, the best things to do are post in the Zoom chat saying POI, as short for point of information, or to very briefly unmute yourself and say point of information. When you're in person, it's saying things like point of information on that. You can get really formal because it comes from Parliament, where basically you put a hand on your head and then you have a hand out here, reflecting the fact that you're in Parliament and you have a wig and like a piece of paper in front of you. It looks very formal. It looks a little bit ridiculous, but it's kind of fun. But yeah, basically you just ask point of information. Zoom, it's a bit different because you can do it in chat. If you're speaking, it's worthwhile having the chat open so you can see when points of information are asked. Or the speaker who's currently speaking can just ask, does X team have a point of information for me? Okay, cool. All right, so knifing. As Boris alluded to earlier, you're in the closing half and your opening has done something quite silly. Maybe they have set up the model that is absolutely ridiculous, such as, I don't know, maybe the topic is violent offenders or non-violent offenders should never go to prison. And they're like, that's totally correct. Non-violent offenders, we're going to shoot them all. We're going to execute them. And you're closing and you go, oh my God, what the hell do we now have to defend? And you'll probably, and if you're thinking about it, you can't directly get up and basically be like, opening government lost it for a moment. They're a little bit weird. You need to be far more formal and subtle with it. So when there is now, when something particularly crappy has happened, is the best way to put it. And the entire viability of the debate is up for question, such as opening government wants to murder all non-violent offenders because that's their interpretation of the model. That's when you can consider knifing. It's not just something like, oh, we have some qualms about the model, like opening government said they're going to give compensation of $1,000. We would prefer if it was $1,500. It needs to be a serious question about the debate. And the other thing is also opposition has to have made it a huge part of the debate. If there is some question about the model and opening opposition has just totally ignored it and pressed on, such as, I don't know, it's something about, you know, we think the government can regulate this, and opening opposition's like, yeah, whatever, fine, we'll let the government do these decisions. Then you can't really get up at closing and be like, guys, we need to basically delete that from the debate. We need to remove it. It needs to be a big part of the debate that has happened earlier. And when that happens, basically there are two ways to handle it. The first one, or depending on what it is, if it's not part of the model and it's just an interpretation of the version of events, then you can basically be like, look, that is a version of events that our opening government gave. We think it's plausible, but what we think is more likely is our version of events, and you basically go through your own arguments. Maybe it's, yeah. So if they're arguing something that is particularly weird, such as this motion would lead to, I don't know, the downfall of all governments around the world, and that would be absolutely fantastic, you can probably get up and be like, that's plausible. We prefer to think that maybe this makes governments work in a better way, and that's fantastic for X, Y, Z reasons. If it is part of the model, you kind of need to show that it's not particularly integral. And that comes with the fact that it's something that opening government or opening opposition has added to the debate, which is not part of the debate. It was never meant to be there, such as murdering of non-violent offenders. It's not integral to the motion. At no point could, they've really pulled that out of the motion and said that that is an important part of this debate. And basically you're saying, in the nicest possible way, that this is not really part of the debate and a reasonable motion can still happen. It's really important to make sure that you're doing it in the nicest way possible. Don't use the words knifing. That's a very quick way for the adjudicator to get concerned. Basically, you're like, look, opening government had an interesting interpretation of what happened. We think this is more likely, or we think this is a more appropriate model that still has a viable part of the debate. You don't want it to be, I'm deleting bits of the debate that, I can't win. It needs to be something that is fair for opposition to clash with, but it shouldn't be something that's basically immediately putting you in the position of fourth because you have to defend a mass murder of people, which is, wrong. I hope that makes sense. It very, very rarely comes up, but when it's done, making sure you're very formal and careful with how you're doing it is the best way to handle it. Make sense? Okay, all right. So this is the final-ish part of the session in terms of more specific advice for each position. But I think I then also gave more advice about opening and closing half. So it's a bit weird, but it'll be fine. Opening government. I'll say this again. Don't panic. I know there's 15 minutes and you're probably going, oh God, I need something to say. Don't panic. If you panic, you start grabbing the first arguments that come to mind and you probably don't argue them to the full amount of depth. So it's important to just think about it as we need to run a straightforward substantive case. What is the problem in this debate? Why are we debating about it? What's the imperative? There has to be some reason we're doing this. How is this policy going to fix it? And why might this be the only way and the only option to fix it? To try and, narrow what opening opposition can run. Because your goal is to try and remain relevant throughout the best debate, for the majority of the debate. Find the best material, really flesh it out, force all the other teams to come to you. And when you're finished and you're both sitting down, make sure you're asking POIs and forcing opposition to engage with you. Something else I stole from Will Jones is opening government is the best position or easiest position to come at least second. You might not be able to win. If you think about it, there are 3 other teams, 2 of which have had over 45 minutes to prepare before they get up to speak. But because it is very straightforward and very simple, and if you are able to really, and as you work on it, you can really highlight the basic parts of debates, it is relatively straightforward to try and get second, to run the substantive case, force teams to engage with you. It's when you panic that the wheels start coming off the bus and things start going wrong. So just run the basic stuff. Don't force yourself to come up with really interesting niche things. Just run simple, straightforward things and force teams to engage. All right, opening opposition. The best thing to do is to put forward your own substantive case as to harms about this motion. Don't try and debate semantics or whether things are going to get implemented. That's easy ways for your closing opposition to get past you, or the closing half to have the proper debate behind your back. You want to be able to prove a substantive case of your own. What are harms that come out of this policy? Do we need to do this? What are benefits of the status quo? Things like that. Because your goal is to try and remain relevant throughout the debate. And something to think about opening opposition is you want to try and grab the debate away from opening government. You want to be the team providing the best characterization of this. You want to be the team who is able to show substantive arguments that this needs to happen or it doesn't need to happen. Because when you do that, you also force closing half to come to you and you put yourself in a strong position. So make sure you're challenging opening government and make sure you're really running your own substantive case. But also ask POIs as well. Force teams to engage with you and make sure you don't, fall out of the debate. Whoops. Closing teams. At member, focus on getting your extension out of that. Make sure any rebuttal is ideally linked to your extension. Everything should be around your extension as much as possible. You don't want to be talking about other fluff because that's when other teams, again, seem more important, are more relevant to the debate. At whip, you need to do more than just a third speaker. You need to show why your material is important in the debate. Why is it winning? You need to weigh up against other teams that have come out before you. And that does mean you need to balance between filling in gaps of your extension and pointing out how absolutely fantastic your member has been with attacking other teams and showing how your extension is resolving clashes that have appeared earlier. How is it engaging with the clash in opening half? Maybe that was a stalemate. How are you going to win it? How are you clashing with closing opposition? Particularly with each other, you're the only teams that can engage at closing. So make sure you're giving them some time and ensuring that you're showing how you're beating them. I've kind of touched on a few of these things. When you're at closing, everything needs to be wrapped around your extension. So as I've already talked about, when you ask POIs, think about how you can lay traps and figure out ways to broaden the debate. You don't want to give away your extension, but at the very least, you can set up kind of the framework that your extension will appear in. You don't want to give away your extension because your opening might run that material. And you also want to ask POIs to the other closing team to force them to engage with your extension. So don't let them run away with stronger teams or anything. Force them to come to you. Okay. And so they're the main things that apply to both closing teams. More specific things. If you're government whip, you're the only speaker who gets the actual chance to respond to closing opposition. I've lost many debates being a government whip and being like, closing opposition, they weren't that important. Other teams were more important. I'll deal with them. And then closing opposition gets the first. And I look like a bit of a fool in terms of just being like, they weren't that important. So make sure you are pushing back against them because you're the only speaker that gets that chance. Don't give closing opposition, 14 minutes to talk about the rest of the debate and no engagement from anyone. If you're closing opposition, especially, you need to make sure you get your whole extension out at opposition member. Your whip does not have a lot of room to add things because they're like a third negative. They're the final speaker. They only have so long. And they have limits on what they can bring in. They can't bring in the entire extension. They can't really add a lot to it. They can only add responses. Things that aren't like a kind of next logical flow on from what had come out previously. Okay. This might be cheating, but tactics are a bit different from strategy. So I included that here. In 3-on-3, it's all about how to beat the other team. In British parliamentary, there are other factors to consider, and this is language you'll hear from time to time. Opening teams can fall out of the debate. That basically means the material they argued about were not part of the main clash. They weren't super important to the rest of the debate. It might be opening government gets up, talks about oceans, and everyone else talks about governments and consumers, right? They weren't that important. Closing teams might never get themselves into the debate. They might run things that just weren't that important compared to what had come out at opening. It's all about, and I think there's a real skill that you get from 3-on-3 in terms of identifying clashes and how to win them. That's a skill you should carry over here. Because if you can figure out those main clashes that have come out earlier, that's the way that you can win those clashes and do well in the debate. And also make sure you're dealing with the stronger team because that makes you look better and it might get you a better position in the room. Okay. If you've watched Tom Stansfield's video, you'll literally recognize these graphics. This is the final part of this training session, and I kind of want to get you guys to interact a little bit. So here's kind of the setup for a hypothetical debate. Opening government has run their things, and it's relatively clear that they've lost the debate. They haven't run the strongest stuff. You've been able to push back with the rebuttal and beat them. You are 0-0, hence the green box around you. And opening opposition, you're pretty confident that you're going to do well against opening government. what would you do from then on? What should be your strategy?
Take POIs from closing gov.
Mm-hmm. Let's say you still have, so you still have your deputy leader of the opposition. What should they be doing as well?
You can probably in this situation try and steal a bit of material from your closing, because you don't have to spend too much time on rebuttal if opening opposition is rebutting themselves, or opening government is rebutting themselves, right?
Yep. Okay. What I'm trying to get at is in a 3-on-3, you could probably just continue to lay into the other team, and that's all you need to do. Here, as both of you have pointed out, you do need to think about the closing clash that is coming after you. This is kind of the next thing to think about in British parliamentary, once you start getting an idea and the strategy that you need to have in debates in terms of how teams are going. You want to do what is the bare minimum required to get ahead of opening government. Once you've done that, you want to be thinking about what's happening in the closing half. You want to make sure that your substantive case is as solid as it can be, that you have things like, what about the even ifs? What are the depths that I can bring here? So you can force closing government to really deal with your material. So they have to engage with you because you've clearly won the opening half. But also that you're blocking out some things from closing opposition, or you're forcing closing opposition to have to engage with you far more in terms of what's new, what's unique about their material. Does that make sense? As kind of thinking about, what should I be doing to beat other teams in this debate? Okay, here's another example. So let's flip it. Opening opposition has relatively clearly lost at the beginning. Opening government has done reasonably well in the opening half. And that means closing opposition can probably run a lot of the things that opening opposition should have run. It's the really strong opposition case, really good ideas. Your closing government, what should you do?
Since OG won't have a chance to respond to the strong op case, you have the best chance to, so you'll want to, do that to the best of your ability.
Yep.
I'd want a really strong extension in that case.
Yep. So the other, so as again, both of you highlight, the important thing is you need to figure out how am I going to beat opening government and how am I going to beat closing opposition? Because as I have mentioned before, if you basically also just jump on opening opposition, you might make it very clear that they're the unfortunate losers in the debate, but you're not really helping you. You've maybe just shown yourself that you're third. You haven't exactly helped yourself set up first or second. And so what that means is that you do need to focus on closing half. You can't let closing opposition run away with a very good opposition case. That might set themselves up for first and second. So that's the use of POIs and that's engaging with their team. But you also really want to try and drag attention away from opening government. You want things like strong extension. You really want to engage with closing opposition, possibly even do things like point out how absolutely fantastic they might be in terms of how they get ahead of opening opposition or opening government so you can bring them down. But you really want to make sure the adjudicator is not thinking about how opening government clashes with closing opposition. You want them to think about how are they clashing between closing opposition and closing government. And so it's just thinking about tactically, how can I force the adjudicator to focus on this part of the debate rather than another one? And that's through POIs, that's through substantive, it's through things like rebuttal. But these are thinking about debates at far higher levels. It's something to keep in the back of your mind. I think my earlier hints are more useful at the moment. I hope it's clear. It's just something to think about. I know this has been very long. I hope I've not bored all of you to death. Does anyone have any questions? Anything that was unclear? Any worries? Anything they want to ask?
Not a question, but more of a request. Would you be able to send us the slides by any chance?
Should be able to. I believe we're also planning on putting this up on the Monash Debaters YouTube page, and so we'll make sure the slides are there as well.
Cool, thanks.
I have a couple of things that I want to add if I can.
Go ahead.
So the first is just a note on extensions, which is that the twin criteria that a judge will be looking at for your extension are novelty and relevance. Sometimes you're going to have an extension that is naturally very, very relevant, in which case you should be thinking, how do I make this sound more novel? How do I spend my time making sure the adjudicator understands that it is something new, something that I'm adding, even though it's just a bit of depth under subheadings that have already existed in the debate. Other times, your extension is going to sound really, really, really new and really left field. Spend extra time explaining the very detailed links about why it's relevant to the debate, how it clashes with things already in there. The second thing that I wanted to say is to just extend on this knifing example that Drew brought out earlier, with the idea of that we would never imprison non-violent offenders, and your OG says, well, we'll just execute them all instead. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to involve you using your judgment in sometimes a very refined way. But in this case, there is a very clear test that tells you what you should do in this. The opening government in British parliamentary has what's called semi-divine right of interpretation, which means that essentially, as long as they are within the spirit of the motion and aren't doing something that is a priori morally egregious and abhorrent to everyone in the room, then their decision goes. For example, if they get up and they say, this debate occurs in the developed world, then that's where the debate occurs, and your lovely extension about the developing world is irrelevant to the debate and you will not win with it. Right? But if they get up and they say something that is clearly outside the spirit of the topic, like executing graffiti artists, then you get up at closing and you say something like, ladies and gentlemen, the definition given to you by our opening is clearly outside the spirit of this topic, which is about whether or not community service or home arrest are more appropriate for non-violent offenses than prison terms. We think that is not a legitimate interpretation of this topic, and we are going to restart this debate about that. We're going to give opening opposition chance to respond to that through POIs, but frankly, they should have seen this coming anyway, right? And then you just reset the debate because they've clearly broken the norms of debating to do that. A more edge case example might be something like if they'd said, we think that non-violent offenders should never be imprisoned because we think definitionally something that is non-violent can never be a crime because we only recognize the violation of a person's body as an immoral act that is done to somebody else. Nothing else can ever be a crime by definition, right? If your opening government does that, it's not really against the spirit of the topic. It's not quite what the topic was about. It's not really morally egregious in the way that would require you to knife them. So you're kind of obliged to accept it as the definition in the debate. However, you would probably be wanting to do things like saying, we don't think anything that's non-violent can be a crime, but even if they were a crime, they are not the sort of crime that would be allow us to imprison someone for any moral reason, right? So you've got to use your judgment to work out whether or not the opening half team is making good decisions in these cases.
Yep, would totally agree with all that. Any other thoughts, queries, concerns? Okay, cool. Thanks for